Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, perhaps this is something a little different as well, and maybe a complementary paper to the one we've just heard. And I'd like to speak today about what I term the creative logos, the idea of coming face to face with God and setting these ideas amidst the problems of technology and images, and a peculiar sense in which experience is increasingly mediated through the dim mirrors of screens, social media, and generative artificial intelligence. And what I'll present and talk about, I suppose, is a series of fragments or encounters with the Logos. And this is derived through the experience of creative action and contemplation in my work, both as a writer and a visual artist. And so I'll present this in a way as a kind of series of images, a kind of poetic presentation, if you like. In his commentaries on the Gospel of St. John, Origen writes, "Observe the forms and beauties of sensible things and comprehend the word of God in them. If you do so, the truth will reveal to you in all such things only he who made them, outside of whom you have nothing to contemplate, for he himself is all things. For whatever truly is, in all things that are, is he." And in her Book of Divine Works, St. Hildegard writes, "The soul pierces the eyes, for they are its windows through which we come to know creation, and only in the word does the soul discern creation's powers." And so in both of these beautiful passages, we have here a connection to a vision of the Logos, a vision of the word, and to the image of creation. By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made, and all their host by the breath of his mouth. So as a visual artist, working with computers and with other media, I'd like to reflect on this idea of a vision or image of the Logos, and on the sense in which we both recognize and are transformed by it, the image of the Logos through our creative nature. And in the context of this conference, I would situate this work, my own work, within the Christian Platonic tradition of imaginative and poetic vision. And in emphasizing this poetical visionary tradition, I would also speak to a kind of creative theosis of the human person, considering how making art and experiencing artworks play a part in deification or an imaginative vision of God. Now, I'd like to discuss what I would term a kind of Christian technological mysticism, which is to say, an embrace of the mysteries of the Logos through the creative capacities and possibilities of new media and technology. And if this idea appears a little obscure or even pretentious, I'd like to point to some of the remarkable insights of the Canadian Catholic philosopher of media, Marshall McLuhan, famous for his writings on technology and communication. Indeed, McLuhan studied here in Cambridge in the 1930s, completing his doctorate on the trivium and the intellectual history of the West. In a 1954 lecture, McLuhan said this: "The most poetic thing in the world is the most ordinary human consciousness. As we trace the rise of successive communication channels or links, from writing to movies and TV, it is borne in on us that in order for their exterior artifice to be effective, it must partake of the character of that interior artifice by which in ordinary perception we incarnate the exterior world. Because human perception is literally incarnation, each of us must poet the world or fashion it within us as our primary and constant mode of awareness. Our faith in the incarnation has an immediate relevance to our art, science, and philosophy. Since the incarnation, all men have been taken up into the poetry of God, the divine logos, the word, is Son. So McLuhan, I think, understood very keenly and prophetically, I think, that technology transforms our universe, and that insofar as these technologies can alienate us, they can also transform our relationship to God. So as he says, activating the inner activity of our likeness to God is a kind of counterbalance to the tendency for the exterior artifice to become a kind of distant reality of its own. And this, I think, is something we see in a tendency with certain kinds of technology that seem to take on this autonomous reality of their own, either through our own intentions, which is to say, to set up some kind of virtual world to escape this one, or perhaps just as a consequence of our actions by which we forget our own investment in their creation, and so they become something seemingly apart from us. And in a sense, what McLuhan said there sounds quite Barfieldian, and there's an interesting connection between the two of them. McLuhan had read Barfield. And so, in a way, McLuhan's sentiment follows Barfield's in that the way is through, as it were, not back. And both McLuhan and Barfield cite William Blake, and I think both could be considered disciples of the great visionary that he was. And Blake wrote of creating space, creating time, according to the wonders divine of human imagination. For Blake, of course, as Kathleen Rain has indicated, the imagination is Christ, the Logos. Blake writes, all things are comprehended in their eternal forms in the divine body of the Saviour, the true vine of eternity, the human imagination. And his contemporary Coleridge, of the productive Logos, human and divine. And so Barfield, whom we've heard about, was keenly informed by Coleridge as well as Blake. And Barfield said that all meaning flows from the creative principle, the to poien, whether it lives on as given and remembered or is reintroduced by the individualized creative faculty, the analogy perceiving, metaphor making imagination. And we've heard a lot of interesting things about Barfield today, and I would add to that he, alongside McLuhan, has a very keen sense of how our symbolic relation to technology has a particular impact on our imaginative capacity for both engaging with others, engaging with the world, and engaging with technology. Now, there have been other writers recently in the 20th century, like Barfield and McLuhan, who've also recognized this central connection, if you like, between the creative logos, a kind of divine inner vision, and our understanding of what it is to kind of incarnate or create. So Philip Sherard, the Orthodox theologian and poet, wrote that by virtue of the fact that man is created in the image of God, he is also a creator, a maker, an artist. Indeed, this is his distinguishing role, that which is capable of making holy. And the late Dominican, the poet and painter David Jones, has spoken of poiesis as the essential mode of our nature, our unique mode of apperception. And so creation in this sense is an act of participation, of becoming like God. And something of the artist's inner vision and inspiration is realized in the work of art, whether this is through intention, gesture, movement, or form. There is a transformation of material, whether paint or pixels, a sort of outwardness from inner vision and action. A transference, we could say, of the spiritual imagination into the media of artistic practice. And I would include in this the computer. Jacques Maritain, himself an influence on Jones, writes that the artist is, as it were, an associate of God in the making of beautiful works. By developing the powers placed in him by the Creator, and by making use of created matter, he creates, so to speak, at second remove, Artistic creation does not copy God's creation, it continues it. And just as the trace and the image of God appear in his creatures, so the human stamp is imprinted on the work of art. All things were made by him. And I spend a lot of time myself, of course, framed within these mirrors, these screens. And sometimes when I'm writing and sometimes when I'm sat making artworks, I look every now and then to an icon that I have beside me on the wall of Mandylion, the impression of Christ's face on cloth. And as I was preparing this paper, I was thinking about this image, I was thinking about creativity, and I was thinking about how this sense of contemplating that image shares in some sense with a kind of stillness that one enters into in prayer or spiritual reflection. And I was thinking on the prologue to the Gospel of St. John. No one has ever seen God. The only Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known. We see God through the Son, the Logos, divine revelation, the incarnation, the divine person of Christ. We see God in partaking ourselves, the action of the creative Logos. And so in seeking God, we envisage him in our creative acts. We seek his face. Christ's face on the Mandylion, the icon, the akeropoieton, the image made with our hands. And as we see God through the face of Christ, we find our face in a vision of others. Bulgakov writes that ultimately the task of earthly human creativity is to find one's authentic, everlasting face, to reveal oneself. All earthly life is summed up in discovering one's own face. And creation is the art of the Logos. In the beginning was the Word. We've seen the images of the geometer, and as Milton writes in Paradise Lost, he took the golden compasses prepared in God's eternal store to circumscribe this universe and all created things. St. Hildegard, writing in the voice of God in the prologue to St. John's Gospel, says, "To behold my face, therefore, I created mirrors in which I consider all the never-failing wonders of my antiquity. These mirrors I made to sing together in praise, for mine is the voice as of thunder with which I move the whole circle of the earth with the living sound of all creatures. I, the Ancient of Days, make them, for through my word, which without beginning ever was and is in me, I bade a great brightness to come forth, and with it countless sparks, the angels." And I'd like just to turn just momentarily in a brief digression to this angelic imagery, because it's been something that's actually been quite central to and important to some of the work that I've made, that I'm not sharing with you today, I'm afraid, but for which I've been working on. And I was struck by this remarkable passage a little while ago by Tomberg in the Meditations on the Tarot. And he writes that the wings of an angel are immobilized after having touched God. They're held in contact with divine understanding and divine memory, imagination. The two wings, he says, are therefore related to the contemplative and creative aspects of God, which in their turn correspond to the divine image and likeness in man. Angelic wings are due to the union of effort and grace, just are those of the divine likeness to be recovered in man. And so this seems to me an important and interesting principle for how we understand and apply our imaginative and creative capabilities, in that we reach outside ourselves, across the space to another. Our images in this way become part of the figuration of reality, what Barfield termed our collective representations. And these are our reach to divine memory and understanding, our receptivity to grace, our discovery of the inner life of the Logos, and thus our connection to others. Returning to my theme, in his study of Pope Benedict's theology of the face, Aidan Nichols comments that the face brings us to the mystery of the person. And Benedict writes, the act of faith is an eminently personal act, anchored in the most intimate depths of the human eye. But precisely by being so personal, it is at the same time an act of communication. In the depths of its nature, the I is always linked to the you. An authentic relationship that becomes communication can only come from the depths of the person. In its most intimate nature, faith is therefore a way of being with someone, of shattering that isolation of my I, which is also its malady. The act of faith opens out onto the distant horizon, breaking down the barriers of my subjectivity. It is this that Paul describes when he says, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And we can think about some of the consequences of the alternative view to this in the sense of our alienation from each other through our engagement with certain kinds of technology today. And so this address to the you, to the other, is a central feature, I would say, of the spiritually created image of sacred art. The eye of the artist, in a sense, dissolves into the matter of the work and is transcended by the eye of the percipient in seeing the artist's vision within this material form of the work, this outward formation of an inner vision and inner life. And so the artist creates or incarnates as a renewal of the sacred inner world, and thus opens up a space for the you to see through to the work of the artist as if through a lens into the depths of their soul. And sacred art in this sense, in its proper function, calls to a kind of common likeness, which in itself becomes individuated. A likeness we find at the heart of imagination, united in this image of the Logos. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. St. Augustine writes of St. Paul's words, but the image, which is being renewed day by day in the spirit of the mind and in the knowledge of God, not outwardly, but inwardly, will be perfected. It is making progress towards it now through a mirror in an obscure manner. And so sacred art brings us closer to the face of God in a kind of communion of creative form. But of course, in a world of social media and in a world where the computational understanding of the person removes them from a likeness to the divine, we risk losing this task of perfection. Callistos Ware writes that when man participates in the divine energies, he is not overwhelmed by some vague and nameless power, but he is brought face to face with a person. And so turning away from these energies is a turning away from God's face, a turning away from this likeness within us. And so in the experience of sacred art, whether that's the dance of abstract light thrown by stained glass, a painting, a photograph, a film, we can be brought into a kind of theophany of the divine countenance. We recognize what Hildegard calls the light that redounds the radiance of his face. And we discover what Bulgakov calls wisdom playing before the face of God. And the act of recognition and discovery is a part of a journey upwards and inwards. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? Those who seek him, those who seek your face. And so the personal relationship that I have described as emerging out of a kind of recognition of the Logos within us, of seeking God's face through the image of the Logos, and of becoming co-creators or associates of creation in Maritan's terms, stands in contrast to the way that our creativity seems increasingly outsourced to technology. And if in a formulation that McLuhan might have used, we conceive of AI and generative technologies as the created extensions of man, then we can imagine that as those technology reflects our fallen aspects, they might also reflect the gift of creation given to us as a reflection of divine work. And that is our capacity for theosis. And so as an artist working with computers, with the digital technologies, I myself have been somewhat resistant to the use of generative AI, even though in a sense the use of non-generative kinds of software, in a sense, is also a giving over of a creative form into the patterns of code and systems of software, whether that's within certain kinds of functions or parameters of how creative tools work. But this, in a way, is an act of translation as well. And to varying degrees, I suppose, any kind of tool in artistic creation, whether it's the tendency of bristles to move against the direction of a gesture or the rebounding shift of a chisel from stone, these things are a kind of tension. And the artist works in a kind of concordance and discordance with these tools, ultimately balancing those polarities into a symphony of action. And it must be said that although these tensions exist, it cannot be doubted that newer technologies do contain, it seems, a greater potential for this erosion of artistic agency, not only in the matter of the individual, but in the manner of their nature as vehicles for a kind of divine inspiration. Because in a sense, we create these technologies as a partial reflection of our nature, but then we imbue them with the entire image of humanity. Blake writes in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. And of course, one of the great images of Christ is the door. For I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. And so if we combine these Blakean and biblical images, seeing ourselves positioned within this contemporary cavern of technological culture, then we can perceive that the image of the logos of the word together transform our perception. Augustine writes, what man can teach another to understand this truth? What angel can teach it to an angel? What angel can teach it to a man? We must ask it of you, seek it in you. We must knock at your door. Only then shall we receive what we ask and find what we seek. Only then will the door be open to us. And so concluding, this image of the door opens us out to an image. We move beyond the threshold from darkness into the true light that enlightens every man, the light which darkness has not overcome, the light of the world, the participated symbol of the Logos, in whom our own creative nature is realized as imagination. For as St. Paul says, it is the God who said, let light shine out of darkness, who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. And so the Logos descends into creative activity. The Logos is imagination. And thus, insofar as a loss of creative vision in technology has created some of the maladies of our time, the rediscovery of imagination is itself a turning back towards the face of God and enables us to see and create the world anew with the technologies at our disposal. And so this work of the creative Logos is to be discovered anew within our present social, cultural and technological moment. A rediscovery of beauty. Dietrich von Hildebrand writes of the nobility that lies in the contemplation of the beautiful. A beauty, he says, that opens our hearts, inviting us to transcendence and leading us before the face of God. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth. I'm going to monopolize for a little while because this was such a beautiful expression of sort of the Catholic mind, you know, with von Hildebrand and Ratzinger and Aidan Nichols. And this for me, this was absolutely incredible. So there are kind of two things I'd like to bring up because as we were sort of saying before, privately, this question of the image and its theological transcendent significance, you're onto something. And I want to talk about what you mean by poiesis here. And this is, I think, really important. Because as you were talking, I was thinking of sort of what happens when we just take a picture of something we see on holiday. You know, I'm here in Cambridge and I take a picture of something and I put it on social media, on Instagram or whatnot, and just the facility of it, just the sort of mindlessness of just snap, 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 compared to what you were talking about with the resistance of material, sort of the poiesis of the artist, where you're Michelangelo's fighting with the marbles, so to speak, looking for what's underneath. And that doesn't have to be material, it can just be time, of something unfolding in time. So the second point I want to bring in with this into one question, I guess, two-part question, poiesis and sort of the struggle to bring forth the image. Second, I kept thinking of liturgy as you were talking, just sort of this, how is liturgy this ultimate expression of the poiesis that you're bringing up? And you know, the sacrifice that Paul says happens once and for all, is sort of prolonged, sort of kairos moment of the Eucharist that continues this until you get to sort of the book of Apocalypse, of Revelation. It's kind of this grand choreographed heavenly liturgy. So I think that the Catholic minds like you and I think of beauty in terms of this grand choreographed liturgy, whether heavenly or earthly, and their reflection, and how liturgy is all about sort of taking a moment, this once and for all, and inhabiting it, and drawing it out in almost this poetic way. So two-part question, poiesis and liturgy.
Yeah, thank you for a really thoughtful response. I was thinking, first thing that struck me when you were talking about images and our propensity to want this kind of immediacy was that this kind of peculiar contrast of our moment, which is on the one hand, the proliferation and ubiquity of images, on the other, this kind of iconoclastic kind of tendency in culture as well. There's this sort of rejection of images as much as there is a kind of embrace of sorts.
Can you trust the skepticism?
Yeah, that's a part of it, I think, isn't it? And of course, I suppose for different reasons, we probably are right to trust those intuitions, because I suppose some of the newer technologies are showing us a very uncertain and unstable world where, as I said earlier, this sense of those things which we make going beyond us, but taking on some, demonic almost energy of their own. And I suppose in some senses as well, in response to following us on with the nature of poeting or making or thinking the world in those creative terms. This has always seemed to me just a very ordinary part of experience to some degree, but it seems something we almost stubbornly refuse to acknowledge in some sense. And perhaps that is accompanied in some degrees with the particular pursuit of technological ambition we have, with a degree of secularization. And Sherard said something really interesting on this. He wrote an essay for Temenos some years ago on, and it forms part of one of his books as well. I think it's the book Art and the Sacred. But he kind of wonders out loud whether, what outside of the art of the liturgy, as it were. So this kind of connects both your questions in a way. How can an artist working in what he termed a non-traditional society, which I suppose in a sense we could class as being most of our kind of modern technological industrialized societies that have kind of turned away from a divine conception of reality. What can an artist do, and can they make an effective kind of sacred art outside of the way in which that art making was once more embedded within liturgy? We can think of icons, we can think of other forms of Christian art. And his answer to that, I suppose, is to say that this is really a sense of what an artist must do now, in some ways, is find both within and outside the liturgy a way to reconnect with images in their most essential nature. And I was reminded as well in this sort of our conversation earlier about the nature of the inner word. In a sense, I feel an affinity of that with the sense in which, with what an image is, and what it means to image something. That it's not just something that operates on the level of a kind of fantasy, but comes out of a deeper conception. And this is why I think I was interested to point to things which for me have just been naturally appealing about these, what I call images of the logos.
Because the church fathers, logos is an inner word, it's a thought.
Yeah. And we think about the practice of the Jesus prayer and these kinds of inner transformations. So, and I mean, I've often also meditated on this idea that's presented in the cloud of unknowing, which is this idea of, in a sense, and although of course these aren't words of guidance prepared for an artist like me, and nevertheless I think there's some things to take from it, which is the sense that one has to suppress below them a cloud of forgetting, which is to say a way of trying to put aside the noise and images that are around us, to position oneself readily to go up to a cloud of unknowing. And for a point, we're in this section. And that seems to me part of this kind of habitation idea you spoke of.
Yeah.
That it seems to be a space to occupy and creating something. That there's an act of suppression as part of an act of anticipation. Right.
Thank you. On that note, I wanted to ask about ascesis. Whether we contemplate an image, a theory of physics, a natural image, or technique, a man-made image, what would be the equivalent today for an ascetic practice to clear away, as you said? Would it be to make life a little bit more difficult? So instead of having instant gratification by creating an output from a language model, you're actually forced to do something more difficult. Chiseling a statue.
Yeah, this is interesting because it came back to some questions this time last week. That I was talking about another paper I presented at a conference called Creativity and Creation, which is in Oxford, and I'd mentioned a little more about one of the quotes I said here about this idea of the effort of meeting grace. And so there's some sense in which there is a kind of a work or a labour to that, which has, the ascetic dimension. But yes, I mean, first of all, I suppose one could say that is probably one of the first sensible things to do as far as a certain resistance to the allure of the immediacy of things is concerned. It seems to me no coincidence in that way that even if they've not been driven by, let's say, religious or spiritual motives, there's been a tendency across different art forms in the last decade or so to move towards slowness as a mode of operational making, and whether that's in terms of the preparation of food, whether that's in terms of how one trains a camera on something, or how one goes about making something. There is this sort of almost hesychastic kind of impulse to making, which in a sense turns away from the tendencies of acceleration and immediacy that some of these things offer us. Because of course what we see, as in a way seems obvious, is that if we try to save some time by getting a generative software to write a paper for us, instead of the hours and time I spent trying to create this, then we lose something. And that seems to go without saying. But of course, in some strange sense, we've lost sight of that because we only see it as a game. But conversely, it's not. So it seems to me there's a whole manner of things we can do that could approach that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for a beautiful paper. I think it really was in parallel to the previous session where we were talking about the logos and the inner word. But here, the sort of visual expression and Plotinus, in that passage quoted by Barfield, he mentions logos. So when he discusses the statue of Zeus by Phidias, it also is an expression of the inner logos rather than the imitation of a sensible reality. And so in this sense, if I understand you correctly, visual art is a form of speech, or used to be traditionally seen as a form of speech. And I also thought about what we said in the previous session, that today the problem academia faces is that it's not that what we say is the end product of, it's not that reality, then from contact with reality comes the inner word, and from the inner word comes the outer word, but people just begin with the last stage. So they just speak whatever comes to their mind, and there is no continuity. And maybe the same problem is with visual arts. So I understand you saying that. I thought about this book that I gave you some time ago by a Polish painter and writer, Józef Czapski, who when he was in a Russian concentration camp during the war, he wrote this short text called Vision and Contemplation. And then later in his life, he said that artists should study St. John of the Cross and the mystics, but they never do in the 20th century. So for him, the work of art was only the end product of a long period of contemplation, revelation, grace, all of that. So I think it's a very important. So you put in order things that were completely reversed, right? So first is reality, then is our contemplation of reality, and then maybe there is a work of art, or maybe we write something, or we do something. So I think it's very, very significant.
Yeah, I was reminded just there of another incredible statement by Barfield, where he says, we've lost for the time being that vision of the inner origin of outward forms, which constitutes perception of their meaning. And that's exactly what you're saying, isn't it? Yeah.